Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Suzanne Kincaid. I'm the COO of Aperio Clinical Outcomes. I've been in the clinical research industry for over 20 years, I'll leave it at that. And my foundation has been mostly in early phase oncology, but I've done everything from being a study patient to joining a site, being a site manager, a study coordinator, to leadership at AstraZeneca over their early phase oncology program. And so that you guys can focus on our very esteemed panelists, I'll let you know I'm in a boot because I hurt my foot doing Zumba. So nothing very exciting, but wanted to get that out of the way. So let me introduce you to my colleague, Tony Bumarch. Tony, please introduce yourself.
Hello, folks. My name is Tony Bumarch, VP of Global Quality Assurance over at Aperio. That means transparency, by the way, so take good notes. Been in the industry 20 plus years also. I focus on quality in the GCP arena, and that's pretty much where I reside.
Deb Turangian from Turangian & Associates.
Hi, everybody. Deb Turangian. I am a clinical research consultant at this time. My focus is on outsourcing, strategic partnership development, contracting, and really working with folks to put together their clinical budgets so that they can get appropriate funding. Prior to this, and I hate to say it like this, but it's real, they've had 20 some odd years. I'm in it for over 30. So sad but true. My prior career was both in high-tech leadership positions, biotech leadership positions, and then the last 15 was with Novella Clinical, a CRO here in the area. I've held positions as Vice President of Project Management and Project Planning, Vice President of Business Development. I was a COO of an imaging company, so on and so forth. So I'm a dinosaur.
Thank you, Deb. And Juliana Blum from Humacyte.
Hi, everyone. I guess I'm a little green. I've only been at this for about 15 years or so. I'm a co-founder of a company called Humacyte. We're here in RTP. We make tissue-engineered blood vessels. I currently run and manage all of our strategic operations, including both internal and external operations. Classically trained as a PhD in cardiovascular and molecular biology research, and started this adventure back in 2003.
Thanks, Juliana. So today we're going to talk about having good partnerships in clinical outsourcing, some tools that you need to help you evaluate partners fairly and make the right choice, how you manage the transfer of responsibilities and demonstrate your oversight, and then some secrets to successes in partnerships. Just to give you some background, when we look at layoffs in the industry, between 2011 and 2016, over 25% of layoffs were in R&D, and that leads us to just more and more outsourcing. It's projected that by 2020, nearly 60% of global spend in pharma will be on outsourcing. And then we look at the perceptions of outsourcing. The Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development says that 77% of companies report full service outsourcing regularly, but only 26% of them feel like they're doing it effectively. So we're hoping that when you leave here today, you have some tools and tips to help your outsourcing be a little bit more effective. So we want to start with the basics of choosing the right partner. And I want to start with Deb, because this is kind of what you do for a living now, is help people choose the right partner. So what's the first thing that you need to think about when it comes to choosing the right partner, Deb?
There's a lot of considerations, but what we all know is that there's a tremendous number of CROs out there. And some have very specific therapeutic expertise, some have very phase-related expertise. But what you want to do is consider what you need yourself. You want to consider several aspects. The first aspect, I'd say, is what are you doing? I mean, what's your approach? Are you doing a phase 1, first-in-man, healthy volunteers, and you need a CRO that has a phase 1 unit? Or are you looking at a global phase 3, and you're looking for a CRO that has a footprint across specific continents that you're targeting? Narrow down your search. The other thing is, you want to think about what are you doing as far as your compound or your device. What's your strategic intent long term? If you're planning on selling after, let's say, you get a signal, then you don't really need a long-term strategic partner. Then maybe you do need someone who is just small that can focus on that particular study. The other thing you want to look at is, what is your internal resource, talent pool, and technology pool? And what gaps do you need to fill? So hypothetically, if you have a clinical operations person, they might be able to do some of the aspects of managing this study. Maybe you only need a functional service provider if you have certain skill sets in-house. So really take a look at what you need there, because again, you might be reducing that CRO pool. The next thing that I would say is, take a look at your actual funding, right? What do you have as far as dollars associated with moving forward with a CRO? It could very well be that you need to go with someone who is very creative, a CRO who is creative, and maybe you can't do full service. Maybe you don't have the finances to do that, but maybe you can contact a CRO that will give you more creative strategies associated with maybe staff augmentation. Maybe staff augmentation combined with functional service, but again, that's a smaller subset of CROs. And finally, I think it's important for you to think about whether or not you're willing to do any of your functional service outside the US. If you have a tight funding constraint, you might want to think about doing separate types of functional service. I mean, as an example, PVG in India. I have a client that works biostats in Armenia. I mean, there are different options that are high quality CROs with cheaper prices, but to do that, then you need to be overseeing all of that, right? So there's trade-offs. But the takeaway is, before you start looking at CROs, you really need to be clear about what you want. And that really leaves the last piece. And this is my all-time favorite, and that's politics, all right? We can't go anywhere without politics. So know that you might have an investor that says, oh, really? Well, I think that you need to go with this particular CRO. Or you have a board of directors member that says, oh, but this CRO over here was my favorite. So yeah, you're going to be putting those in the mix as well. But again, bottom line, know what it is. After you look at all of those considerations, know what your outsourcing strategy is going to look like, and then you'll have a much lesser pool to pick from.
And Juliana, what about for you? What's the first thing that you feel like people need to think about when they're choosing a partner?
From our experience, we really look for somebody who's an extension of ourselves. We're a pretty disruptive technology in the sense that a tissue engineered blood vessel has never before been done, which means it's never been investigated in a preclinical model, it's never been investigated in a clinical model. FDA wasn't even too sure what to do with it when we first brought it to their attention. So for us, it's looking for a partner who can be an extension of ourselves that we can collaborate with versus handing off and just letting them do and us stepping back. So those types of groups, are very unique. Not everyone is comfortable with the sponsor coming in and standing next to them hand in hand and walking through the project from the beginning to the end.
Juliana, how do you find partners?
For us, it's really been through networking and talking to other innovative leaders out there who they've used that have gone well, who hasn't gone well, understanding what the highlights of some organizations are, and I think Deb pointed it out, depending on the phase that you're in and even the country that you're in, really determines who the best partner is.
Great. Deb, what about you? How do you find partners?
Well, I agree with Juliana that you really want to reach out to trusted colleagues, right? That's number one. I mean, this is a great group to network with right now, right? You can also hire an outsourcing professional who does this kind of thing for a living, but honestly, you can find out a tremendous amount of information just on the internet and researching social media. I know that sounds crazy, but social media is really a big one these days to find CROs. But what I will say is, get at least your top, let's say 5 to 10, and make sure that you put together a request for information, an RFI, that really delineates all of those areas that you took into consideration. send those out. And there's no commitment there. You're not going into bid defenses or anything like that, but send those out, get that information so that you can come up with, your top list. And again, keep whittling it down.
Yeah, that request for information, I think something nice about that, even if you think you know about one company but want to know about another two, send it to all three of them. That way you can really, truly compare them evenly. And you might learn some things you didn't know about maybe your favorite or the one that your board of directors is partnered with. Deb, you talk about starting the outsourcing strategy with an outsourcing plan. What is an outsourcing plan?
Well, hopefully you have an SOP in place that's for vendor identification, evaluation, selection. I'm assuming that you do. That SOP will probably dictate to you, as an example, certain steps that you need to take associated with identifying those vendors from the very beginning of the relationship all the way through to the end, to the selection. That being said, as an example, that outsourcing plan would be where you have gone in and taken a look at your protocol, identified where you have gaps in resources and technology, and identified the type of partner that you're looking for. And the second part of that is getting together with your evaluation team at the company, those folks who are the decision makers, and identifying really a weight as far as how important is each one of those considerations, right? Because not everything has an equal weight. There are certain things, maybe therapeutic expertise has a higher weight than an extension of your team from a cultural perspective. It could be any of the above, but it's actually documenting all of those so that you can then execute that SOP and demonstrate how you have looked at each one of those aspects. And I always say this, and I say it about everything, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? If you document it and you follow your SOP, then you can always go back and say, yes, we made this particular decision based upon this criteria, and this is how it was met. And let's hope you don't get tangled up in one of those political things. I'm just saying.
Before we move on to our next topic, I wanted to invite you guys against the back wall. You're welcome to come down front. We've got plenty of seats down here. For the next portion, I want to talk about the tools to evaluate and compare your clinical development partners. And Tony, I want to start with you. What do you need in place to start comparing vendors?
Well, as Deb mentioned earlier, some type of a qualification procedure, so that way you can make sure that your vendor meets specific criteria for pre-qualification, qualification, and requalification. And that pre-qualification procedure is more like a screening procedure. It's a process where you take and send out a questionnaire. You're going to ascertain high-level information, and you're going to ask for specific high-level documents such as table of contents for your SOPs, your procedures. You might ask them for their FDA experience, past inspection history. They might send that to you. But you're going to basically use that pre-qualification process to screen. And you might have 5 or 6 particular vendors that you're interested in initially. Send out your pre-qualification questionnaire, get it back, get a team together, go through the information, and then weed them down. Maybe you want the 2 or 3 left, at which time cost could be an important factor, but also quality is an important factor. So basically, the pre-qualification process is nothing more than a screening process. From there, we go to a qualification process. In the qualification process, we're actually going to go out on site, or we can do it remotely via questions and checklists. And what we're trying to determine there is the processes and procedures that they have on board. Are they robust enough? Are there sufficient types of procedures available? I mean, there's key procedures that most organizations have to have. You've got to have procedures for disaster recovery and operational continuity. You've got to have procedures for issue management, et cetera, et cetera. So these things you're looking for, and as you peruse through them during the audit process, you want to make sure that they meet specific requirements that you're satisfied with, because the procedures you have as a sponsor, for instance, very similar. You're looking for gaps also in those procedures. So maybe they don't have a procedure for something that's critical that you think that they should have, at which time, it might be embedded in a different procedure. So that table of contents for the SOPs is not always very, very telling. That's why you've got to go out on site and actually take a look at that. Then we do our requalification. The process of the requalification is going out on site, but now they've been managing the study for a period of time, and we've got data that we can look at. So we can take that data and we can compare that against the procedures that they said that they were going to follow, and we can measure compliance. And that's the real purpose of the requalification. It's to see if they're complying with the procedures the way they said that they would in generating our data.
Thank you. Deb, what about you? Anything you want to add on what you need in place to start comparing vendors?
Well, everything that Tony said, I agree with completely. What I will say is you can do some things from an operational perspective concurrently. What I mean by that is, let's say you've already sent out your request for information. You're down to a short list. These are the kinds of CROs I want to go with. You're going to qualify those CROs, but maybe you don't go on site. Not yet, right? I mean, most of you don't have deep pockets. If you have deep pockets, great, do it. But if you don't, hold off. In your RFP, your request for proposal to that short list, ask for that table of contents with SOPs, okay? But let's talk about that request for proposal for a moment. You really need to get as detailed as possible. Back in the day when I was at a CRO, we would get just high-level specs. Oh, just give me an idea, high-level specs. Get as detailed as you possibly can to get the very best proposal you can, and detail by function, by activity within function. But I'm going to suggest you do one more thing, and that is ask that CRO about allocation percentages. Because if you're going to start comparing, and you're going to start comparing budgets, then what you also need to compare is what is the allocation basis for the team that they've identified. Let me give you an example. You could go to one CRO and they could say, yeah, it's going to be $2,000 for project management. We all know that's a joke. But $2,000 for project management, right? And the next one says, yeah, mine's going to be $2,000 too. But if you don't ask for allocation, CRO A might be giving you 10% of an FTE. CRO B might be giving you 50. If you're a small biotech, you want high touch. You're going to want to make sure that you have the highest allocation you can to get the best bang for your buck. So don't just ask about functions, but do. Don't just ask about table of contents, but do. But also ask about allocation so you know what you're paying for. So comparing those, I ask the CROs to use my grid. I give them my grid that says, this is how I want you to break it out. Now, we all know that not every CRO costs things out the same. An example I always use is the TMF. Sometimes they put it in regulatory, sometimes they put it in project management. It really depends on that particular CRO. But that's why you ask, as much as possible, give me detail as you compare costs using my grid. That way, you can use something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, and from a budgetary perspective, have a good understanding of who's coming in where. But again, I can't stress enough allocation. Know what kind of allocation you're getting as far as the people on your team.
Suzanne, can I just add to that? I think allocation is important, but knowing who they're allocating as well. So when you go through an RFP process and you go through the interview with your finalist, they're going to put the A+ game in front of you most likely. And you're going to want to ask, is this the A+ team you're delivering when I choose you for the vendor? And if not, then you want to ask, who are you giving me? And how do they differ in skill set, experience, and capabilities from the people sitting around the table with you? Because that's important.
So one other thing I'd like to add to that also
We all want to say something about that.
is during the pre-qualification process and or the qualification process, you can certainly ask for turnover rate information. So they can run some reports and you can figure out what the turnover rate is. You got a high turnover rate at a facility, that's telling, very telling. Why are they leaving? Why are they there such a short period of time? Something's up. So chances are you could get stuck with a turnover process, and we all know that turnover is extremely costly. Food for thought.
2 points, okay? I'm just saying. Make sure in your contract that you have the ability to select a replacement if any of your core team members leave. That's critical. Not all CROs will allow that. Now, we're not asking for them to be indentured servants. We know that that's not real. But you do at least need to have the ability to pick who is coming onto your trial next. Now, the other thing I'll say, and this is on the flip side, when you're talking about CROs, don't be asking them to come with their dedicated team 9 months before you're going to start the study, or 6 months before you're going to start the study. Because what they don't do is put people on a shelf and say, hey, we're going to hold you there for Joey Bag of Donuts Company, and then we're going to pull you down whenever they might be ready. Be clear, their proposal, that CRO proposal, is going to commit to certain headcount within a certain period. They're going to commit to certain prices within a certain period. If you go outside that period, know that you need to call them back in again and say, hey, I know that you said you gave me the A team, but I know that that was 6 months ago. I want to see exactly who you're going to give me within the next 60 days. Make sense?
So Tony, what are the minimum things you expect to see from a vendor?
Wow, that's a big question. So when I'll do a qualification audit and go out to take a look at their quality management system, QMS system. The QMS system is a compilation of electronic or paper systems that basically build quality into all of their output. It builds quality into everything. So the procedures have to be consistent, the staff have to be trained, et cetera, et cetera. So within the quality management system, what we're looking for, there's multiple components, multiple layers, so to speak. One of the big ones is a quality document management system, QDMS. So within the QMS, we're looking for QDMS, and within that QDMS, we are looking for, do they have appropriate procedures? Do they have a structure for the procedures? Are they consistent, internally consistent? Is there a template that they're modeled after so that way they can replicate? Are they accurately reflected? Is it a situation where there's gaps, or there are situations where there are procedures that are actually missing, as we spoke to earlier? So that's the QDMS system. There has to be control over those documents too. So control, making sure that versions of these documents are controlled. You know, which template, which form are people going to be using? You don't want somebody throwing a document in their drawer, pulling it out a year later, and it's an old version, it's been updated 5 times. That's a typical audit finding, and it's quite common occurrence. So those are the kinds of things you're looking for there. So within the QMS, once again, we'll go down to the auditing component. The auditing component, internal audits, such as a process or procedural audit. We'll do a trial master file audit within the facility, for instance, or external audits, such as site audits and vendor audits. You got to have some type of a process at the vendor's location that will take all of these processes that are on a schedule, called a master schedule, if you will, or a master audit plan. So that's showing you that they do have the capability to look forward and project that, okay, we're going to do some internal auditing here. We're going to make sure our procedures are tight. We're going to do some external auditing there to make sure our studies are running properly, et cetera, et cetera. From the auditing component, there's a training component. It's not just the GCP training that the company's requiring you to give, but the training component is very important. What do you do with that information when you get back from an audit? That's the real gem. Taking that information, pulling it all together, developing a presentation so that way you can train your staff on that. Here were the pitfalls. Here's what we did wrong. Here's what we did right. Here's what we need to do to fix it. Here are the procedures we've got in place that are addressing that or lacking, one or the other. So that's critical. So that training component is very, very valuable. Also, we have another component for quality meetings. Quality meetings will take a lot of the information, pull it all together via metrics, your key performance indicators, your key quality indicators. You'll take all that information and you'll put together a meeting depending on your frequency. We do a quarterly quality council session, if you will. We internalize that information. We look at the metrics. We're looking for signals. We're looking for process improvements. We're looking for anything besides the issues that we already know about, how we're managing that. But that's what those quality meetings are all about. We have issue management process also within the QMS. Within issue management, we're talking about things such as SOP deviations. Are we tracking and trending every time we deviate from a procedure? That's valuable information. What if we're deviating, we're noticing a spike in deviations for a particular procedure? It's very high. Is it a lousy procedure? Is it something that they're not complying with because we're missing some steps, or it just doesn't match the process that they're actually doing or performing? We also have CAPA, which is corrective action and preventative action, issue management process. So we have to have some type of a definition that what is CAPA worthy. Everyone knows what a CAPA is pretty much. But within our organization, we've got a particular definition that says you've got non-compliance, and then it meets a specific threshold for serious non-compliance. Everything that's serious non-compliance is CAPA worthy. Everything that's non-compliance, you may want a CAPA also. That's your prerogative, but at least serious non-compliance is worthy of CAPA. What am I missing? What am I missing?
I think you got it all.
I think that'll do it for now.
Thanks, Tony. Juliana, how do you compare vendors?
So for us, I think as a small organization that has a newer technology, we're more on the kind of touchy-feely side. We want folks to come in and talk to us about our RFP. We don't want them to regurgitate the information we asked with. We want to do a session that we work through the project together. We want to hear their thoughts on how they would approach something like ours, which is probably outside of the box of their current processes and protocols. But we don't want to just hear the information we've asked about. We want to know how are they going to apply it, and how are they going to make the study successful, and how are they going to support it in a way that gets us to our end game. And oh, by the way, hope you don't mind having us along all the way. We're very collaborative.
And I think where the magic starts to happen and you start to know which one is your preferred vendor for that particular project is where you move out of the Q&A and you find yourself starting to solve problems together. You start brainstorming together and the energy in the room changes and there's an excitement. So that's where you really know you're starting to click.
For us, that's where we definitely identify those. And it's on the clinical research side, but in other areas of the business as well. You know, we really look to collaborate and work together with people in a way that moves the ball forward. And I think you get that excitement when both teams are energized in the same way to solve the problem and address the issues that need to be completed.
So I want to talk a little bit about managing the transfer of responsibilities. And for those of you that don't know what that is, when you're doing a drug filing, where you're opening your IND, you're telling the agency, here's what we are outsourcing to another party and that we're not doing directly. And that's a very short form, but there needs to be a more detailed version. I'm happy to give this to anyone, as a template. We have a template we're happy to share if you reach out to me afterwards. But I wanted you to see so you can visualize what we're talking about. There's a column for the sponsor responsibilities and a column for the CRO responsibilities. So when we get into managing the transfer of responsibilities, Tony, I'll start with you. Why is that transfer important?
Well, let me give you the QA answer for why it's important. Number one, it's a federal requirement. If you look up 21 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, I think it's 0.53, you'll notice in there that anything that a CRO transfers and delegates over to a CRO has to be in writing. And it should be clear and concise. One of the pet peeves I have with transfer of obligations is you'll see dual responsibilities. So the sponsor is supposed to do it, and also the CRO is supposed to do it. So you end up with, need I say more? So in that instance, it needs to be a little bit more granular, so that way you can specify, well, within this particular line item, the sponsor is responsible for that, and the CRO is responsible for that. That's important. It's very important. It's a common audit finding, but it drives the FDA crazy when they come into your house, want to do an inspection. They're going to hold you accountable for all of that component that you've got an X next to your column, and you're really not responsible for it. So,
Deb, what about you? Why is the transfer of responsibilities important?
Well, everything that Tony just said, but then from a clinical operations perspective, there's several different aspects to think through. When you think about putting together your contract, you want to make sure that that transfer of obligations is in your agreement, but you want to make sure that it is very, very detailed so that there are very clear assumptions about who is doing what, because that's going to help from a costing perspective. The second part of that is, if you're very, very clear about who's doing what, then you can put together an oversight plan and understand what it is that you're going to oversee and how you're going to oversee it. And then finally, there's the actual just transfer of responsibility, right? It's actually meeting with that CRO, training that CRO on your protocol, even on your culture, and really understanding, having them understand exactly what it is that you not only require but expect.
And Juliana, what are some of the pitfalls in the transfer of responsibilities?
Definitely just handing off a package and saying, here you go, this is what I want, especially if it's not detailed or clear. Keeping in mind that you both succeed or fail together. So at the end of a clinical trial, the results are yours and you own them. And if you don't oversee the work and transfer the responsibilities appropriately, you own that data, come out good or bad. And it could be a compliance issue, it could be an issue from just following the protocols that you put in place. And so I think really taking ownership, as Tony was saying and Suzanne was saying, there's that form, you have to submit it. But you would never, send your kid to school and not pick them up at the end of the day, right? It's kind of the same thing. You don't send your clinical trial out and not check in on it, every
that's
now and
debatable
then.
sometimes.
Well, I don't have teenagers yet, but maybe I'll change my mind. But, but it's yours. You own it, and you're responsible, and you just need to follow that through. And I think it goes back to collaboration, and you want to find a partner who's willing to bring you along, and who understands that they're helping be an extension of your organization, and they're delivering for you in a way that you're accepting that delivery.
Deb, what about you? Any pitfalls in that transfer of responsibilities you can think of?
Well, yeah, I would have to echo what's already been said to a certain extent as far as seeing the transfer of obligations, but yet duplicating activities, right? Well, you go ahead, CRO, and you do it on your side, and then we're going to do it on our side too. It doesn't make sense financially, and it doesn't make for a good partnership, and it doesn't make for clarity on who owns what. So again, I go back to the contract and being very, very clear about who is responsible for what activities and how they're going to be performed.
So I'll move us into talking about demonstrating your oversight, because it's not just pitching it over the fence when you've hired a partner to run or operationalize your clinical trial. So Tony, when you think about your filing and the agency asking you, how did you demonstrate your oversight? Were there any problems with the trial conduct? What did you do about them? What does it mean to demonstrate oversight?
Well, if you read the Bioresearch Monitoring Compliance Program, within that, that's the playbook for the FDA on conducting inspections. When they go through that, one of the major sections is clinical ops, obviously. And within clinical ops, did you have any sites that were terminated for cause? That has to be explained. Well, it's important to have the documentation to support that. Not just that, but that's the evidence of what the sponsor did from a due diligence perspective. You just don't whack a PI, a principal investigator. You basically got to show the agency that, okay, here's the issues that we had. Found it on a monitoring report, or maybe that and coupled with an auditing report. So we went out, we put a corrective action in place and a preventative action in place, a CAPA. And after we followed that up, we went back for another monitoring visit to take a look at where we are with that particular process. And we either did or didn't make the progress that we expected, at which time the federal regulations also require you to promptly seize all drug and terminate the individual if they do not promptly become into compliance. So how do you How do you demonstrate that? That is oversight. I've seen many of inspections before where the agency takes a look at the documentation that's available. A particular investigator might have been terminated. They're going to look in the trip reports and say, well, what did you do to bring them into compliance? And there's nothing there. Shame on the sponsor. Shame on auditing. Shame on the company. So it's very important, documentation. It was said earlier, if you didn't document it, it wasn't done.
Deb, what are some tools you can use to demonstrate your oversight?
Well, there's several things that I think are important. One, when Juliana was talking about getting together with the CRO initially while they're putting together their proposal and having a face-to-face and really working through some of these things, I think the topic of oversight is a critical topic, both from a relationship standpoint as well as from a contract standpoint, as well as from an agency standpoint. And what I mean by that is set the expectations together on how you as a sponsor plan on overseeing the conduct of this study. And we're not just talking about project management meetings, although we are. We're not just talking about taking meeting minutes all the time, but we are. We're not just talking about yes, the CRO has the ETMF. We're talking about auditing that ETMF. I'm really a big ETMF auditor fan. Not once a year, but ongoing, because again, these are your family jewels. Mm-hmm. And documenting those expectations, because that's really describing for this potential CRO whether or not you're a high touch, a low touch, what that actually is, and that goes into cost too, right? But it also impacts the relationship because you're doing that together. And then there's the final piece for me, which is the executive oversight. You would hope that the executives from both sides have an opportunity to meet on a periodic basis and review key performance indicators. You need to be clear with that CRO what those key performance indicators are, what it is that you're actually looking at. There are some contracts that will tie that performance into financial incentives, right? But again, I think that it's really important that that be documented, right? And that's where it kind of goes into almost like a governance charter. Now you might say, oh, I just have a small phase one. Why would any CRO work with me on a governance charter? It doesn't matter if it's a functional service provider. You need to have some type of a governance oversight. And I believe that the executives from both companies, if you're spending the money that I know you're spending, deserve or need to invest in that kind of a process and document.
Thank you, Deb. Juliana, kind of in the same vein, what are some things that you can build in to help ensure you're happy with your partner?
So to comment on what Deb said, I think as you're going through that initial phase of trying to set the expectations of how you're going to work together or how you're going to kind of govern the sponsor, if you can't work that out initially, that's part of your selection. I think if you sit in a room and you're like, I think we're a bit disconnected here, that's never going to work itself out. And so identifying that early is definitely key. I think for us, because we're in a different space, in a space that doesn't have clinical trials that have already been done to set a precedence of how to do them, we've put in place just a lot of metrics to kind of track our progress through the study. How many, a big chart or tracker in our offices is what we kept at Humacyte on our side, as well as on the CRO side, just to say, okay, how many sites have we identified? How many are initiated? How many are enrolling? How many patients do we have? And I think those touch point metrics where you can do a quick visual and look at your progress helps to drive kind of the conversations in your weekly project meetings or that executive meeting, because even when the executive walks by in either of the offices, whether it's the sponsor side or the CRO side, they know, okay, this ticker hasn't moved in 3 weeks. That's a problem. I'm probably going to hear about it. Or if you're the sponsor and you say, man, we've enrolled 25 patients this month, we really need to commend the CRO. I think thinking about things in both the positive and the negative feedback are very important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So secrets to building that successful partnership. There's kind of a magic to it, and some of it is the softer stuff. So Deb, I want to start with you. What's important up front to build a successful partnership?
Well, let's say hypothetically you've already contracted with this CRO. The communication doesn't stop there. I can't emphasize enough how much money you're spending and how you need to invest just like you would in any employee that you're hiring. You need to make sure that you communicate, that you give positive feedback, that you give negative feedback. But I have found from my experiences that some of the best kickoff meetings, some of the best beginnings of relationships are where you actually work on communication training within that kickoff meeting. So that when you leave there, you know how to communicate with the various members of your team. We know some people are into facts and data. We know some people will get upset if you didn't ask how their weekend was. We know that everyone is different. Get to learn who those people are on your team and invest that time. You would invest that time if it was an employee, right? You're living with these people just like you're living with the person in the cube next to you. So I really think that that investment is critical. I also think it's important, just like it would be if you had an employee, to know a little bit more about those people at the kickoff meeting. You know, I know it sounds silly, I know I sound like a Pollyanna, but I'm telling you, it has value to go around the room and say, hey, what's your passion? Other than clinical research, we know that's your passion. But beyond that, what else is your passion? When you leave there, I think it's really important to know who it is that you're working for and working with. And I think that, and this is a statement that I've always made, before you leave, you ask each other, you know, we've spent X number of days together, but really, what's going to still keep you up at night? I want to know what's going to keep you up at night, because that's what I have to go home and continue to work on. What's going to keep you up at night? Whether it's the CRO being concerned that there are certain gaps in their knowledge base, whether it's the sponsor being concerned that they didn't think that CTM was really the right person or whatever, but you don't leave that room without saying, this is what's keeping me up at night.
Deb, I'm with you on the Pollyanna piece. It might sound hokey, but investing that time in team building in the beginning is going to help you weather the challenges. Every clinical trial is going to have challenges, but if you have a good foundational relationship, you can work through those together.
You know, just a side note, it just hit me that there's many of you who probably don't even know who Pollyanna is. So, sorry about that. Thank you.
Juliana, I'm going to ask you, what's the number one secret to building a successful partnership?
For us, it's remembering that everyone's human, right? So we're not contracting or consulting with computers. People are going to make mistakes. You as a sponsor is going to make mistakes. I think it's important that we have conversations face-to-face or over the phone. Stop texting, stop emailing, you know, put those things down and have that human-to-human communication, because that's how you're going to understand each other better. You're going to get to the point of what still keeps you up at night versus being frustrated and, you know, maybe sending off a terse email that doesn't quite get to your concern, but you feel a lot better because you sent that email. You know, I think for us, it's just really making sure that you understand who you're communicating with, how they communicate best, and when you have wins, you celebrate the wins, and when there's difficult times, you work through the difficult times together, but solve those problems and then step away. Don't just walk away and shut down, because that doesn't solve anything.
And Juliana, you guys do something really special at Humacyte that I was very pleased about. I'd love for you to tell the group about the training that you put your teams through.
Sure. So we do a lot of team building, a lot of collaboration training. We teach all of our employees how important it is to have that human contact and interaction. Can I tell my story about the military? So a few years back, we were in San Diego visiting the USS Midway, and because I come from a military family, we got a nice, pretty behind-the-scenes tour. And in one of my discussions with our tour guide, I asked, you know, what things work really well for you all now, and what things are difficult? And of course, you know, all the new GPS and all of the new technology that the ships can handle in mass format has been very great. But they said the one technology that's killing us is our phones. So they have recruits and soldiers that can't work and communicate as a team because they're being brought up working on text and email as a form of communication. And so that was really eye-opening, and I brought that experience back to the office, and I said, all right, guys, you know, we need to put the keyboards down, put the phones down, and let's have more touch points. And there were some, more meetings, we hate meetings. But once you get past that and you realize you have to work and communicate in a three-dimensional world, I think our progress has definitely improved, and we've been now not only taking that internal in our organization, but to our external contacts and partners.
And as we have multi-generations in the workforce, it reminded me of a conversation I had recently with my daughter. She's a teenager. She's texting with a friend, waiting on a reply. I'm like, why don't you just call her? And she said, ew, that would be so awkward. And this is a big proportion of our workforce. So that communication training, I'm really impressed that Humacyte invests in that kind of training for your staff. So lastly, I'd just like, before we open it up for questions, key takeaways. What is your number one key takeaway if nobody remembers anything else tonight? Tony, I'll start with you.
Trust, but verify.
I like
That's important.
Deb, what about you?
Know your contract. Communicate, communicate, communicate.
And I would say you are probably the only one that knows your product better than anyone else, and you own it, which means you own all aspects, whether it's inside your facility or outside of your facility.
Yeah, I would add to that just the open and honest communication about risk in your trial and sharing that honestly and openly and collaboratively between the parties is so critical in the beginning and throughout the trial. All right, enjoy the other sessions. As they say, stay for the beer. So thanks, everybody.
I like the beer.